The small frontier town of Willow Creek was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's name, every horse's owner, and every story that passed through the swinging doors of the local saloon. Surrounded by endless plains, rocky hills, and dusty trails, the town survived because of hard-working people who depended on each other. Among them, there was one man whose name was known farther than the town limits, Elias Stone, the strongest blacksmith in Willow Creek. Elias was a man built like the iron he shaped every day. His broad shoulders carried years of hard labor, and his rough hands showed the marks of countless hours spent beside the fire. From sunrise until sunset, the sound of his hammer echoed through the valley as he forged horseshoes, repaired farming tools, and created whatever the townspeople needed. But when the sun disappeared behind the mountains and the forge went cold, Elias returned to a silent cabin where no one waited for him. Years earlier, Elias had known happiness. He had loved deeply and built a simple life with his wife, Anna. They had dreamed of growing old together on their small piece of land. But fate had taken her away, leaving Elias with memories that were both precious and painful. After her passing, he never allowed himself to seek happiness again. The townspeople often wondered why such a good man chose to live alone. Many women in Willow Creek admired his strength and kindness, but Elias never noticed their attention. His heart remained locked behind the same walls he had built around his home. Some believed he enjoyed being alone, but the truth was different. Elias had simply forgotten how to let someone into his life. One evening, dark clouds gathered above Willow Creek. The wind howled across the open fields, and heavy rain began pouring over the town. Most people rushed inside their homes, preparing for the powerful storm that swept across the frontier. At the edge of town, a young woman named Clara Whitmore struggled along the muddy road. She carried a small suitcase that looked almost too heavy for her tired hands. Her dress was soaked, her boots were covered in mud, and exhaustion showed in her eyes. Clara had traveled many miles searching for a new beginning. She had left behind a life where she was constantly told she was worthless and that her dreams did not matter. She wanted a place where she could make her own choices and finally feel like she belonged. But arriving in Willow Creek during a storm was not the fresh start she imagined. The town small and had suffered damage from the wind, leaving no available rooms. With nowhere else to go, Clara stood outside in the rain, unsure of what she would do next. That was when Elias found her. Riding back from checking on his horses, he saw the young woman standing alone near the damaged inn. At first, he planned to continue home. He was not a man who involved himself in other people's troubles anymore. But something in Clara's tired expression reminded him of the kindness he had almost forgotten. Without saying much, Elias offered her shelter at his cabin until the storm passed. Clara hesitated. She had learned not to trust easily. But when she looked into Elias's eyes, she saw no hidden intentions, only a quiet man offering help. Inside the cabin, Clara discovered a side of Elias that few people knew. The intimidating blacksmith carefully prepared a warm meal, gave her dry clothes, and made sure her horse had shelter. She noticed small details, the repaired toys sitting on a shelf for local children, the injured bird he had healed, and the old books he kept beside the fireplace. Elias was not cold-hearted. He was simply lonely. As the storm continued through the night, the silence between them slowly faded. They talked about simple things, the places they had traveled, the lives they had lost, and the dreams they still carried. Later, as the wind shook the cabin walls, Elias looked toward the empty side of the room where he had spent years sleeping alone. For the first time in a long while, he admitted something he had never said aloud. He did not want to spend another night feeling completely alone. Quietly, he whispered, "Sleep beside me, just tonight." Clara understood there was no selfishness in his words. It was not a request for anything more than comfort and companionship. It was the voice of a man who had lost so much and was afraid to hope again. She agreed. Neither of them knew that this single night would become the beginning of a story that would change both their lives forever. The lonely blacksmith had opened the door to his heart, and Clara had found the place where she truly belonged. The morning after the storm, Willow Creek looked like a town that had survived a battle. Broken branches covered the streets, puddles filled the dirt roads, and several buildings had suffered damage from the powerful winds. But as the first rays of sunlight appeared over the horizon, the people began repairing what the storm had taken away. Inside Elias Stone's cabin, the quiet morning felt strangely different. For years, Elias had woken up to the same empty room, the same cold fireplace, and the same silence that followed him everywhere. But that morning, he heard another person moving inside his home. He smelled fresh coffee being prepared and heard Clara humming softly as she tried to make herself useful. For the first time in years, his cabin felt alive. Clara knew she could not stay forever. She had only planned to find shelter until the roads cleared, then continue searching for a place where she could build a new life. But after seeing how much damage the storm caused, she decided to remain in Willow Creek for a few more days and help. Elias was surprised. Most people who saw his rough appearance assumed he was nothing more than a hard man with a hard life. They never noticed the small acts of kindness he did when no one was watching. Clara was different. She noticed everything. She saw how Elias repaired a farmer's broken wagon without charging him. She saw him leave food outside the door of an elderly neighbor who struggled to walk. She saw him rescue a frightened dog caught in the storm and spend hours caring for it until it recovered. "You pretend to be made of iron," Clara told him one afternoon as she watched him work in the forge, "but you have the softest heart of anyone I've ever met." Elias stopped hammering and looked at her with surprise. No one had ever spoken to him that way. People respected him. They depended on him. But very few truly saw him. Clara did. Over the next several days, she began helping around the forge. At first, Elias insisted that the work was too difficult for her. The heat was intense, the tools were heavy, and the work required patience. But Clara refused to give up. She learned how to organize supplies, clean the workspace, and even assist Elias with smaller tasks. Her determination reminded him of something he had lost long ago, the joy of sharing life with someone. For Clara, the forge became more than just a workplace. It became a place where she felt valued. Back in her old life, she had always been told what she could not do. She had been judged by her appearance, her family's expectations, and the opinions of others. Nobody had ever asked what she wanted. But Elias asked. One evening, while sitting beside the fire, Clara finally opened up about her past. She told him how she had spent years feeling invisible. She had been surrounded by people who saw her as a responsibility instead of a person. When she decided to leave, she had no promise of a better future, only the hope that somewhere in the world, there was a place where she mattered. Elias listened quietly. Then he shared his own pain. He told Clara about Anna, the wife he had lost. He admitted that after her death, he convinced himself that loving someone again would only lead to losing them again. So he buried his feelings and focused only on work. "I thought if I stopped caring," Elias said, staring into the fire, "nothing could hurt me anymore." Clara looked at him with understanding. "But if you stop caring," she replied gently, "you also stop living." Those words stayed with Elias. For the first time, he began to question the walls he had built around his heart. The people of Willow Creek slowly noticed the change too. The lonely blacksmith who rarely smiled began laughing again. The man who always ate alone started sharing meals with Clara. The cabin that once felt empty began feeling like a home. But both Elias and Clara were afraid to admit what was happening between them. They had both been hurt before. They both carried wounds from the past. Yet somehow, they were helping each other heal. What began as a simple offer of shelter during a storm had become something neither of them expected. Clara had arrived in Willow Creek looking for a place to belong. And Elias was beginning to realize that maybe he had not been waiting for the storm to pass. Maybe he had been waiting for someone like her to arrive. For several weeks, Willow Creek enjoyed a rare peace. The storm that had once damaged the town became nothing more than a memory, and the people slowly returned to their daily lives. The fields were repaired, the roads were cleared, and the sound of Elias Stone's hammer once again echoed through the valley. But something else had changed. The blacksmith who once spent every evening alone now had someone waiting for him when he returned home. Clara Whitmore had become a familiar sight around town. She helped at the local store, assisted families who needed extra hands, and continued working beside Elias at the forge. The townspeople who had once wondered about the mysterious woman arriving during the storm began to see her kindness and strength. But not everyone welcomed her happiness. Some people whispered about Clara's past. They wondered where she came from and why she had left her previous life behind. Rumors spread quickly in a small frontier town, and Clara could feel the weight of people's curiosity. Elias noticed. He saw the way Clara became quiet whenever strangers asked too many questions. He saw the sadness in her eyes when someone mentioned her past. One evening, while they sat outside the cabin watching the sunset, Elias finally asked the question he had been avoiding. "Who were you running from, Clara?" For a moment, she said nothing. She looked across the open fields, remembering the life she had tried so hard to escape. Then she told him the truth. Before coming to Willow Creek, Clara had lived under the control of a wealthy man named Henry Caldwell. Her family had fallen into financial trouble, and Henry believed he could use their situation to force Clara into a future she did not choose. He saw her as something to possess rather than someone with her own dreams. Clara had refused to surrender her freedom. So she left. She had hoped that distance would be enough to escape him forever. But deep down, she knew people like Henry did not easily let go of what they believed belonged to them. Elias listened carefully, his jaw tightening with anger. He wanted to protect her, but he also understood something important: Clara was not weak. She had already fought her own battles before she ever arrived in Willow Creek. "You should never have had to run," Elias said quietly. Clara looked at him. "No," she replied, "but running was the only way I knew how to survive." Elias reached for her hand. "And now?" Clara looked at the man beside her, the blacksmith everyone thought was unbreakable, but who had shown her more kindness than anyone she had ever known. "Now I'm learning how to stand." Those words stayed with Elias. But their peaceful life was about to be tested. A few days later, a wealthy carriage arrived in Willow Creek. The elegant vehicle looked out of place among the simple homes and dusty roads. People gathered around as a sharply dressed man stepped down. Henry Caldwell had arrived. The news spread quickly. Everyone knew he was powerful. He owned businesses across the territory and had enough money to influence judges, officials, and lawmen. Many people feared him because they knew wealth often carried power. Henry walked into town with confidence, believing Clara would return with him. When he found her beside Elias's forge, his expression hardened. "Clara," he said coldly, "you've caused enough trouble. It's time to come home." The words angered Elias, but Clara stepped forward before he could speak. "I am home." The entire street became silent. Henry looked surprised. He had expected the frightened woman who left months ago. He did not expect the confident woman standing before him. "You don't understand what you're doing," Henry warned. Clara held his gaze. "For the first time in my life, I do." Elias watched her proudly. He wanted to step in, but he realized Clara needed this moment. She needed to prove to herself that she was no longer powerless. However, Henry was not a man who accepted rejection easily. Before leaving, he gave Elias a threatening look. "This isn't over." As his carriage disappeared down the road, Elias knew the danger had only begun. That night, the warmth inside the cabin felt different. The happiness they had built suddenly seemed fragile. But Clara was no longer alone. She had Elias. And Elias had something he had not felt in years: a reason to fight. The lonely blacksmith who once avoided every battle was now ready to defend the one person who had brought his heart back to life, after Henry Caldwell's arrival in Willow Creek, the peaceful life Elias and Clara had built together began to feel uncertain. The town that once seemed like a safe place suddenly felt surrounded by questions and suspicion. Henry had left behind a warning, and everyone knew a man with his wealth and influence could create problems. Elias had faced many dangers in his life. He had worked through freezing winters, survived dangerous accidents at the forge, and fought to protect his land. But this felt different. This time, he was not protecting himself. He was protecting the woman who had brought warmth back into his lonely world. For several days, Elias watched Clara carefully. He noticed that she tried to appear strong, but the return of Henry had awakened old fears. She would sometimes stare toward the road, wondering if he would come back with more threats. One evening, Elias found her sitting quietly outside the cabin. "You're thinking about leaving," he said. Clara looked surprised. "How did you know?" "Because I used to do the same thing," Elias replied. "Whenever something hurt me, I walked away before anyone could take anything else from me." Clara looked down at her hands. "I don't want Henry to destroy your life," she whispered. "Your name, your business, your peace. I came here with nothing, and now you're risking everything because of me." Elias sat beside her. "Clara, you didn't bring trouble into my life." He looked toward the old cabin and the glowing forge. "You brought life into it." Those words gave her strength, but the danger was still real. Henry began spreading rumors throughout the town. He told people that Clara was dishonest and that Elias was foolish for believing her. Some townspeople who had once welcomed Clara started keeping their distance. The whispers hurt her, but Elias refused to let them break her. Instead of hiding, Clara continued helping others. She cared for sick neighbors, helped families rebuild after the storm, and proved through her actions that she was not the person Henry described. Slowly, the town began remembering who Clara truly was. Meanwhile, Elias focused on protecting his forge. He knew Henry might try to hurt him financially, so he worked harder than ever. But one night, his fears became reality. Under the cover of darkness, someone damaged the wooden fences around the forge and destroyed several valuable tools. The next morning, Elias found the damage and immediately knew who was responsible. For a moment, anger filled him. Years of patience and hard work had been threatened by one man's cruelty. But before Elias could take action, Clara stopped him. "Don't let him turn you into someone you're not," she said. Elias looked at her. "He wants you angry. He wants you reckless. But you are better than that." Her words reminded him of the man he wanted to be. Together, they repaired the damage. The entire town watched as the blacksmith and the woman who had arrived during a storm rebuilt what had been broken. Their determination changed people's opinions. Neighbors who once believed the rumors came forward to help. The forge became more than a workplace. It became a symbol of courage. Weeks passed, and Henry's influence in Willow Creek began to fade. People saw the truth. They saw that Clara was not a runaway with a troubled past. She was a woman who had fought for her freedom. One quiet night after finishing their work, Elias and Clara sat inside the cabin near the fireplace. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Elias broke the silence. "When you first arrived here, I thought you would leave when the roads cleared." Clara smiled softly. "So did I." Elias looked down, struggling to find the right words. "I spent years believing my heart was buried with my past. I never thought I would feel this way again." Clara reached for his hand. "And now?" Elias looked into her eyes. "Now I know I was only waiting for someone who could remind me I was still alive." Clara felt tears forming in her eyes. They had both arrived in Willow Creek carrying pain. But together, they had found something neither expected. A home. A family. A future. Outside, the wind moved gently across the fields, but inside the cabin there was warmth. For the first time in many years, Elias Stone was not afraid of tomorrow. Because tomorrow meant waking up beside the person who had changed everything. The days after the confrontation with Henry Caldwell brought a new sense of peace to Willow Creek. The rumors that once followed Clara had disappeared, replaced by respect and admiration. The townspeople had witnessed her courage, her kindness, and her determination. They no longer saw her as a woman running from her past, they saw her as someone who had fought for her future. And beside her stood Elias Stone, the blacksmith who had once believed he would spend the rest of his life alone. For the first time in years, Elias smiled without forcing it. The sound of laughter returned to his cabin, and the empty rooms that once held only memories were now filled with conversation, warmth, and hope. But life on the frontier always brought unexpected changes. One morning, a wealthy businessman from the nearby city arrived at Elias's forge. His name was Thomas Reed, and he had heard stories about Elias's incredible skill as a blacksmith. Word had traveled far about the man who could create tools and horseshoes stronger than anyone in the territory. Thomas stepped into the forge and watched Elias work. "You have a rare talent," he said. "A talent that deserves more than a small-town shop." Elias looked at him carefully. "What are you offering?" Thomas explained that a large company in the city wanted Elias to become their lead craftsman. He would have better equipment, a larger workshop, and a chance to become known throughout the entire region. It was everything a blacksmith could dream of. The opportunity of a lifetime. When Thomas left, Elias stood alone inside the forge, staring at the tools he had used for years. Part of him felt excited. Another part felt afraid. For most of his life, Elias had believed success was measured by what a person built with their hands. He had always dreamed of creating something bigger, something that people would remember. But now his heart was different. Now he had Clara. That evening, Elias told her about the offer. Clara listened quietly, and although she tried to hide it, Elias saw the sadness in her eyes. "You should go," she finally said. Elias looked surprised. "What? You've spent your whole life working toward becoming the best blacksmith you can be. You deserve this chance. But what about us?" Clara smiled gently, though it was difficult. "Love shouldn't be a cage, Elias. I don't want you to stay because you're afraid of losing me." Her words touched him deeply. For years, Elias had confused love with loss. He believed caring about someone meant eventually experiencing pain. But Clara showed him something different. Real love did not hold someone back. It gave them the courage to choose. Over the next few days, Elias struggled with his decision. He walked through Willow Creek, looking at the places that had become important to him. The old road where he first found Clara during the storm. The cabin where they shared their first conversation. The forge where they rebuilt their lives together. Every corner carried memories. One evening, Elias returned home later than usual. Clara was sitting near the fireplace, reading one of the books from his old collection. He sat beside her. "I made my decision." Clara closed the book. "What did you choose?" Elias took her hand. "I choose this." He looked around the cabin. "I choose Willow Creek. I choose the forge. I choose the life we built." Clara's eyes filled with emotion. "But what about your dream?" Elias smiled. "I spent years chasing a dream that I thought would make me happy. Then you came into my life and showed me I already had what I was searching for." Clara leaned against him. "You're sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." The next morning, Elias politely declined Thomas Reed's offer. Many people in town were surprised. Some thought he had given up the chance for greatness. But Elias knew something they did not. Greatness was not always found in fame or fortune. Sometimes greatness was found in the quiet moments, the person waiting for you at the end of the day, the home you built together, and the love that made you feel like you finally belonged. Months passed, and the forge continued to thrive. Elias trained young apprentices, Clara became an important part of the community, and their cabin became a place where people gathered and shared stories. The lonely blacksmith who once feared opening his heart had discovered the greatest treasure of all. Not gold. Not fame. But a love worth staying for. Years passed, and the little town of Willow Creek changed in ways no one could have imagined. New families arrived, old buildings were repaired, and the dusty frontier roads became busier with travelers searching for a place to call home. But one thing remained the same. At the edge of town, beside the fields and under the wide western sky, the sound of a blacksmith's hammer continued to echo. Elias Stone was no longer known only as the lonely blacksmith who lived by himself. He was known as a man who had built something far greater than a successful forge. He had built a life filled with love. The old cabin that once stood silent and empty had become the warmest home in Willow Creek. The fireplace that once burned only to keep one man company now filled the room with laughter, stories, and memories. And Clara Whitmore was still there. She never left. When people asked her why she stayed in a small frontier town instead of searching for a more comfortable life somewhere else, she always smiled. Because she knew the truth. She had not found a place. She had found a person. When Clara first arrived in Willow Creek, she carried only a small suitcase and the pain of a past she wanted to forget. She believed she was searching for somewhere she could disappear and start over. But fate had something else planned. The storm that brought her to Elias's cabin had also brought two lonely hearts together. Over the years, Clara became one of the most respected women in town. She helped new settlers adjust to frontier life, cared for families in need, and encouraged young women to believe they had the right to choose their own paths. Many people admired her strength. But Elias admired something even more important. Her heart. Every evening, when the workday ended, Elias would return from the forge and find Clara waiting for him. Sometimes they talked for hours. Sometimes they simply sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sunset disappear behind the mountains. Those quiet moments meant everything to Elias. Because there was a time when he believed those moments would never exist again. One evening, many years after Clara first arrived, a young apprentice working at the forge asked Elias a question. "Mr. Stone, how did you know she was the one?" Elias smiled while placing a finished horseshoe on the table. He thought about the storm, the lonely nights, and the woman who had walked into his life when he least expected it. "I didn't know at first," he answered. "I only knew there was something different about her." The young apprentice listened closely. "She didn't come into my life and fix everything," Elias continued. "She reminded me that I still had something worth saving." Those words carried the wisdom of a man who had once lost everything important to him. The years had taught Elias that love was not about finding someone perfect. It was about finding someone who saw your scars and stayed anyway. Someone who understood your silence. Someone who believed there was still goodness inside you, even when you had forgotten it yourself. As the sun set over Willow Creek, Elias returned home that evening and found Clara sitting outside the cabin. He sat beside her, just as he had done many years before. "Do you ever think about that first night?" Clara asked. Elias smiled. "The storm?" She nodded. "The night you asked me to stay." Elias laughed softly. "I only asked for one night." Clara looked at him with a playful smile. "And somehow, I never left." They sat together as the stars appeared above them. Elias realized something he wished he had known years earlier. Sometimes the greatest changes in life come quietly. Not with grand victories. Not with fortune or fame. But with a simple act of kindness. A door opened during a storm. A stranger offered shelter. A lonely man asked someone to stay. And that one night became a lifetime. The people of Willow Creek would always remember the story of Elias Stone and Clara Whitmore, the blacksmith who learned to love again and the woman who found the home she never knew she was searching for. Because in the heart of the Wild West, where storms could destroy everything and life could change in a single moment, they proved one timeless truth. The strongest things are not always made of iron. Sometimes, they are made of love.